delivered by the Black Curriculum. All day on Saturday, we have a beautiful partnership with Deaf Fest, who've helped us to programme a series of curtain raisers, incredible performances by Black deaf artists. We've got conversations with Echo Eshen, Dean Atta, Mame Blue, and we've got our award-winning TLF author-in-residence, Victoria Adekwe-Bully. Saturday evening, we close with an epic party, Inua Elms' Rap Party, which is kind of like a house party, but with literature and poetry and live DJs. It's going to be an epic week. And to make this work happen, we need your support. You can support us by turning up, which is what you've done today, so thank you deeply. But you can also donate. Just scan the QR code, which you'll see behind me. It's dotted around the building, and please do support us. The other really easy way to support us is by giving us feedback. On all of your seats, you'll have a feedback form. It makes a huge difference. It allows us to programme more things like this. It allows us to tailor the programming to what the community really wants and needs. It allows us to reach out to funders to tell us about the work we're doing. Please take a moment, scan the QR codes, donate, feedback. After tonight's event, you can also support us by going to the bar. That works, that's fine. So the bar will be open after the event, but you can also support other Black businesses. All through the festival, we've got round tables selling books upstairs. They're here tonight. Our author, Zeinab Badawi, will be doing a book signing, so please buy Zeinab's books. Buy more books, buy books for Christmas, get ahead of your Christmas schedule. If you need support this evening, you can go, so you'll be able to go upstairs to buy the books. If you need support to get into the lift, please just make yourself known to one of the front of the house team and they'll support you to get to the lift. The theme of this year's Literature Festival is Black Imaginations. We were thinking about how, for centuries, Black writers have taken a world that can often be violent and troubled and given us beauty and brilliance. We were inspired by these words from the scholar and writer Walida Imarisha. When we free our imaginations, we question everything. We recognise none of this is fixed. Everything is stardust, and we have the strength to cast it however we will. I'm incredibly excited for this evening's conversation. Please join me in welcoming your host, your chair for tonight, author and historian Paula Akpan. Thank you.
For joining us this evening. It's genuinely such an honour for me to be here. So, like mentioned, I'm a historian, a journalist, and I've also been working with African history, so this feels really exciting and very personal to get to speak with Zeinab today. Again, just to remind you that there will be a book signing afterwards in the mezzanine, where you can also purchase the book, so please do link up afterwards and get a chance to chat to Zeinab. Okay, so without further ado, tonight I'm joined by Zeinab Badawi, a Sudanese-British award-winning broadcast journalist. You might recognise her from the ITV Morning News or Channel 4 News, BBC News. I mean, she's worked across all of the various British media-facing organisations for a number of decades. Her list of accolades and positions run extremely long, so here are just a few. She received the President's Medal of the British Academy. She is a patron of the United Nations Association UK, and she previously chaired the Royal African Society. My voice just got louder, and it's very intense, I love it. Okay, and today she is the president of SOAS-University of London and an African History of Africa. Her first book was published in April this year. Please can you help me in giving a hand to Zeinab as she comes to the stage.
Hello Paula, very nice to be here, and hello to all of you. Thank you very much indeed for taking some of your evening to come and listen to our conversation. It's very good to have you here. How am I? Well, I've been doing a lot of book tours. I had no idea there were so many book festivals in the UK. There are about 400 and I feel like I've done all of them. But you know, what was really very satisfying is that, you know, I go to far-flung places deep in the English countryside, and you know, the auditoriums would be full of people not of African descent or African diaspora, and they were very interested in African history, and so I was very, very encouraged by that. I seem to have the voice of God with this microphone. There we go, perhaps it will settle down.
Well, I imagine the last 6 months have been just a complete whirlwind for you.
Yeah.
I mean, your book was an instant bestseller. Okay, come on. Oh, okay, all right. Demure, very demure. But what have the last 6 months been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a, as I said, quite a roller coaster, because I have gone around various venues in the country talking about African history. But I think it's really stiffened my resolve very much to continue on this mission of trying to spread the word about Africa's history, and really to drive home to people that Africa has history, traditions, customs, beliefs that are worthy of study and worthy of respect and are worthy of knowledge, and to say that, you know, Africa is part of our global story. And I know it's the tail end of Black History Month, but I think every month should be Black History Month. You know, it should be part of the mainstream. It's not, you know, if you're not African, living in Africa, or African diaspora, you're all an African export, because everybody came out of Africa besides the second, you know. And it's like, even, you know, the blonde-haired, flaxen-haired, blue-eyed people amongst you, don't you kind of want to know what happened in the continent of your birth? Which is why I start the book with the origins of humankind, just to emphasize that common origins, you know, the common origins of humankind.
Were you expecting such an overwhelming interest in a very decidedly, a very intentionally African retelling of African histories?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it did fill a vacuum in a way. There's a vacuum, there's an ignorance really about Africa's pre-colonial history, not only in the world but also on the continent itself. I mean, you know, I was quite staggered by the fact that very few Africans knew very much about what happened on their continent before the arrival of the Europeans, and that very much mirrors what goes on, you know, outside the continent. I remember wandering around the University of Lagos talking to Nigeria's brightest and best and saying to them, what do you know about your history? And they said, well, we know that our Atlantic coast is the slave coast, Nigeria was formed in 1914. They could tell you a lot about, you know, the Afro 20th century history, but, you know, they draw a blank. One former Nigerian president said to me, you know, Zeinab, I can actually give you the name of English medieval kings more than I can African ones. And so I was very struck, including myself in a way. I mean, I had little bits here and there, and I like to consider myself a relatively well-educated person. But I think that the interest in the book is that I try, insofar as I can, in one book, to touch great moments in Africa's pre-colonial history, and to try to dispel myths. Principally one that, you know, Africa had no history before the arrival of the Europeans, or Africa's history has been denigrated to say, you know, it's of no consequence. Or what was also very important to me was the practitioners of history. It's very important that Africans are given, you know, accorded the respect of telling their own history. If you only look at Africa's history through a European or a Western lens, you will miss something. And this isn't about supplanting, you know, works. There are some good works by the Africanists. This is about supplementing that work and saying, actually, you know, you have to ventilate the scholarship of African historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, otherwise you'll miss something.
Absolutely, and also so much of what we know has come through colonial accounts who have their own agendas, their own biases that they brought to the work, their own belief systems around Africans and what that looked like. And I guess I just want to go back to, sorry, before I start going on a rant about colonialism, which I could do any day of the week. But I do want to come back just to the origin, the ideation of the book, because it actually came out of a TV series that you did, and The History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi, which was BBC World Service, 20 45-minute episodes, which are actually now available on the BBC YouTube if anyone would like to look them up. So what was that like, first of all? What was the experience for you?
So, I mean, it was really, really probably the highlight of my long career in the media. I went to more than 30 African countries to make this TV series, spoke to dozens and dozens of African historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, paleontologists, and I was really captivated by their vision, their perspectives, and I was troubled by the fact that when I got back to the UK, so much of what they said, hit the cutting room floor, metaphorically speaking, and so that's why I felt I had to do justice to them, or try to do justice to them, and I thought, the long form of a book is much better. But the original idea of the TV series from which the book grew originated one afternoon in Paris when I was sitting at the headquarters of UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, with my friend Getachew Ngida, who was then Deputy Director General of UNESCO, an Ethiopian chap. And as I was sipping my tea, I saw this bookcase behind him, and I saw a series of volumes called The General History of Africa. And I said, Getachew, what are those books? And he said, oh, don't you know? I said, no. And he said, well, these are the volumes of the General History of Africa. And I asked him what that was, and he said, this was a project which was conceived in the early 1960s, during that period of rapid decolonization in Africa, when the newly independent presidents of Africa, like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, they all said, look, we decolonized our countries, we want to decolonize our history. So they appealed to UNESCO to undertake this project for them. So a committee was set up, and they scoured the continent of Africa for the best academics in their fields, and they compiled volume after volume after volume of Africa's history from the beginning of humankind to the modern era. And so I was very taken by this project, and I said, this is Africa's best kept secret. Would UNESCO give me the rights to make a TV series based on the knowledge in these books? And so after a lengthy process of negotiations, I got the UNESCO imprimatur, and off I went to make a TV series. So everybody I interviewed either was a contributor to the GHA, the General History of Africa, or was approved by UNESCO, museum directors or whatever. And so that's very important, because history is often contested, and I felt that having a huge body of scholarship, such as the General History of Africa, as the kind of backbone of the book, was very, very important. Of course, later on I had to supplement it with, considerable more research, and that's when being president of SOAS was very handy, because it's one of the best libraries in the country, so I had free rein there. So that's really why the book is called An African History of Africa, because it brings, the vision and the research and the scholarship of African academics.
That was stunning. I was also still stuck on how you just name drop, various colleagues at UNESCO, your friend who's a director at the UN, This is all very impressive. But I would love to strip it back to young Zeinab Badawi. How was your interest or love of history or things ancient, how was that nurtured from a young age?
The relatively young Zeinab Badawi. I actually studied PP at Oxford, philosophy, politics and economics, but I was always interested in history, and that was my postgraduate degree at SOAS, where I'm now president, ironically, is where I did my postgraduate studies in history. But I was always interested in history, and particularly Sudanese history, because I remember talking to my parents about the pyramids in Sudan, And this was when I was very young and I hadn't yet seen them. And so that was always something that was percolating at the back of my mind. And I suppose if I had to find a time, that would be, you know, when my interest in history was awakened. And then education, I suppose you could say education really is the family business, because my great-grandfather was the pioneer of female education in Sudan. He was, at the turn of the last century, the 20th century, he thought to himself, look, you know, I've got all these children, the boys go to school, but my daughters are not going to school. I don't see why that should be the case. And he was a real feminist in a way, Babika Badawi, Sheikh Babika Badawi. And in fact, we say in the family, he was so pro-women, he married 4 of them. You know, a blight on an otherwise, you know, blemish-free record. So he had a lot of children, more than 30. And he set up a school in his own home, in the courtyard, for his daughters and also girls from the neighbourhood. And, you know, he was criticised by the locals and even the colonial authorities. The British said, look, Sheikh Babika, don't do this, it's, you know, you're getting too much flack for it. But he persisted and set up schools for girls, and the family have a university for women, not only for Sudanese women, but women from other parts of Africa and even further afield. So, you know, I grew up with aunts and great-aunts who were highly educated, you know, PhDs from Western universities and so on. So I like the educative role in writing a book as well, because I think, you know, I hope with the book that I inform and educate and entertain a bit, but also stimulate people into wanting to know more about the particular aspects of African history that they may have read about in the book.
Yeah, because I feel like you give people a teaser, you know, like this is an entry point, this is a platform for you to go off and do further reading, further education. And I mean, it is such a rich and sweeping overview of African histories. How did you decide on the content inside the book? So, you know, the kingdoms and countries that you covered, like, did you already have an idea of what you wanted to write, or was it more led by the travels and the research that you undertook?
Yeah, I suppose the book really benefited a great deal from... Shall I take this one? So I suppose the book benefited a great deal from the TV series, and television obviously being picture-led. I tried to focus on parts of African history where there was visual evidence, you know, the monuments, the statues or whatever, so that was one thing. And then also I tried to focus on aspects of African history where there were great personalities, because I think, you know, history is best understood if it's seared into the imagination, and I think you do that by talking about people. You know, we all know about the Reformation in England because of Henry VIII and all his marriage issues. And it was the same thing really with, you know, great moments in Africa's history and the personalities that were involved, which is why the book really is very kind of figure-led, as it were. And then I wanted to make sure that I touched great moments in Africa's history, north, south, east, west, central. And so there may be other great moments that I missed, of course, but I feel that the whole continent gets a bit of a fair shout. And I reject this idea of sub-Saharan Africa and the so-called Arab North or the Arabized North, and for me, I take the continent as a whole.
Can you tell me a bit more, because this is something that you waded into, which I think is very useful for those of us who are of African descent, but not necessarily from the north of Africa. What kind of considerations did you have to take on board when trying to explore the Arabization of Northern Africa?
I mean, the Arabs first went in and conquered Egypt about 641 Common Era CE, and by 711 they had pretty much conquered all of North Africa and settled there. So, of course, they Arabized a lot of the people, they intermarried with them, although, of course, you have the indigenous people, the original inhabitants of North Africa, the Berbers, or as they prefer to be known, the Amazigh, meaning noble or free people in their own language. And so, yes, the Arabs were there, but I mean, I think that, you know, it's the same thing when people talk about the ancient Egyptians. You often say to people, do you know of an African king? They'll say Tutankhamun, and then they'll say, but were the ancient Egyptians actually African? I think we have to redefine what we mean by African. There isn't necessarily just, you know, you don't have to look a certain way or, you know, behave a certain way. It's just the same as everywhere else in the world. Africa's got a Mediterranean coast, and so the people along that part of Africa, of course, they will have mixed over the years with people from Western Asia or from, you know, Southern Europe, just as in East Africa, people would have mixed with people across the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula. And that's the same as everywhere else. You know, migration is something which is, you know, as old as humankind. And so I think that, you know, Algeria has a border with Niger. We think of Algeria as an Arab country. Actually, you go to the border and you see that the people in Niger and the people in Algeria are very, very similar. The same with Morocco and, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that, for me, it's all, you know, I'm very much a Pan-Africanist, and Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was Egyptian, was a great Pan-Africanist. You know, it was he who found an Egyptian wife for Kwame Nkrumah in a spirit of brotherhood and, you know, fraternity and a spirit of Pan-Africanism. So I think that this sort of salami slicing of the continent is not something, it's not something that I really accept. You know, when Nelson Mandela was released in 1991, the first country he visited as a free man was Algeria, top north, you know, of Africa, to thank them for their support during the apartheid era. So I think that, you know, we need to revive that kind of Pan-African spirit that existed decades ago. It's not there. I hope it's the light to sleep up.
I mean, just side note, I don't normally listen to audiobooks, but do you narrate your own audiobook?
I did narrate it. It was like a life sentence. I was, you know, imprisoned in this tiny cubicle the size of a small public loo, practically, you know, and you just sit there reading from about 10 till 5 with a lunch break where you sort of come out blinking into the light like some kind of troglodyte, eat your food and then go back in again. But yeah, I did it, but I did it in record time. That's where being a broadcaster helps. I'm used to reading and speaking.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sounds horrific for you.
It was horrific.
But I was just thinking, listening to your voice, and it's very soothing and also imparting a lot.
Sends you to sleep when you listen to the book.
So, of the many locations and histories that you cover, there's a very personal one in your exploration of the Kingdom of Kush, which forms part of present-day northern Sudan and southern Egypt. There's something incredibly affecting and humbling about ancient history in general, or at least for me, or maybe other history nerds, but especially when you have an ancestral connection. What was that part of the work like for you?
I mean, you'd forgive me if I did say I was biased, that I loved all my travels, but the travels in northern Sudan, which is exactly where my family originally from, was the most fascinating for me in a way, because I could see, because this is, you know, something that people think about history, they think it's just something you can consign to the past, and of course history, you know, does explain our past, but it also informs our present, and it helps shape our future in a way. And so I was very struck by the things I saw in the ancient kingdom of Kush, which I recognised in my grandmother's house, you know, the water urns and the black coal liner that the women wore. You know, they still do that in, you know, in my family. And actually it was Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt who's the first person who's credited with using finely ground burnt frankincense as eyeliner, so thank you, Hatshepsut. So anyway, that's what I liked about that particular history, but I mean, in every chapter I try to look at something that's relevant today, and I think that that third chapter, The Kingdom of Kush, really illustrates how if you use the long lens of history, you see how actually empires rise and fall. And today Sudan, is in this heartbreaking, ghastly situation. And yet it wasn't always so. It's the Kingdom of Kush. There were kind of 3 iterations. In its earliest form, it predated ancient Greece and Rome. And the part I focus on in the book is 2500 BCE first, the Kingdom of Kush in Kerma, and then 1500 BCE in Napata, but principally on the kings of Kush from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, before Common Era, when the kings of Kush reached the zenith of their power. They conquered Egypt and ruled it for the best part of a century. And, they had an amazing, flourishing civilization. They built 1,000 pyramids. About 200 of them are still standing or preserve part of their superstructure. There are about 100 pyramids in Egypt. There were temples, exquisite jewelry you see in museums. The ancient Sudanese were great at doing ceramics, pottery. In fact, some of the pottery found dates back to something like 8,000 BCE, and there are those Sudanese archaeologists who credit the ancient Sudanese with being the first people to enamel pottery. But not only was it a great African civilization, it was also a regional superpower, because the kings of Kush, with names like Pianki, Tahardko, Shabako, Shabitku, they were the main protectors of people like King King Hezekiah of Judah, or the princes of Byblos and Phoenicia in modern-day Lebanon, because they were all sort of under attack from the Assyrians, who were the most warlike army in that part of the ancient world. And the ancient Sudanese, fought them and defeated them on numerous occasions. They were very skilled archers, very good horsemen. They would have a particular special way of releasing their arrow from their bow, and they'd get their opponents right in the eye. And we know very little. People know very little about ancient Sudan, and I think that it tells you how history is relevant today, because one interesting little fact about the ancient Kushites, the ancient Sudanese, is they considered it an abomination to eat fish. So imagine they had the 2 Niles, the Blue Nile, the White Nile, which become the single Nile, and then it goes through Egypt and ends up in the Mediterranean. The ancient Egyptians ate fish, the Kushites didn't. And to this day, the Sudanese have one of the lowest consumption of fish anywhere in the world. It's about 1 kilogram on average per person per year, compared to Egypt, 25 kilograms on average per person per year. I've got a brother who can't stand the sight of fish, and plenty of relatives like that. So it's remarkable that something like that has persisted to this day.
And I guess when we think about the richness, the texture, the layers of African history, and also how much has been, by design, but also by the erosion of time, kept from us. I guess while you were researching all of these various kingdoms and regions and cultures and civilizations, what does that emotionally do to you as well? Because you're collating, but I guess, is there an element of being reminded of how much you've, I don't know if you've been cheated, or at least robbed of the opportunity of knowing earlier?
I think there is an element of that, because although I was born in the Sudan, I've lived in the UK since I was 2-3 years of age, so I've had a completely British education. And I think that, yes, what I realised, on my travel and talking to these African experts, was that, how they invert the telescope. And instead of looking at African history through the eyes of, you open a book and it's Livingstone and Stanley and Cecil Rhodes and, that kind of thing. So I thought it was good to kind of just flip it and see, who the Africans were. People know about, Jan van Riebeeck arrives in the Cape in South Africa, 1602 and so on. But who were the people whom he encountered? There was Abshimato, Cecil Rhodes, Lobengula. These are people who've been largely relegated to the background. And so it was just putting them to the foreground that I felt was important. So if you want to put it in that way, that, felt cheated. But, it made me realise that, of course, so many of our accounts that we get from the Western sources are inevitably slanted. So somebody like Shaka Zulu, who was born in 1787 in southern Africa, of course, the king of the Zulus, is depicted as this kind of bloodthirsty tyrant. And if you speak to Zulu historians, they'll tell you about, what a remarkable soldier he was. Yes, I mean, he was quite ruthless, but there was more to him than that. He was a poet, he composed music, he was a great military tactician and strategist and so on. So you just get a more kind of multi-dimensional, image of Africa. What's known as the certain battles, are given their names by British or European historians. The Africans have different names for them. So it just made me realise that we are missing that diversity of perspectives, and that's what I wanted to do, was to bring that diversity in.
In your introduction, you write that you're dealing with facts rather than fairy tales. What does that mean to you?
So I think that, there have been a lot of prejudices, as I said, about Africa, where Africa's history's been denigrated. And so I thought the best way of confronting that is by using facts, really. I'll just explain why I think African history has been sort of slightly denigrated, is that Western historians on the whole, and understandably to some extent, put a lot of emphasis on the written word. And they'll say, some Africans didn't write and therefore they had no history. But just because Africans didn't always write didn't mean they didn't record their history. You just have to get at it in different ways. And that's what UNESCO's volumes do, the General History of Africa. They use other sources, as well as they use written sources that the Western historians overlooked, like Arabic, because the Arabs were in Africa much earlier than the Europeans. South Asian languages like Gujarati or Persian and so on. So they'll use these sources, but they'll also look at oral tradition. Oral tradition is very, very important for the telling of African history. As Chinua Achebe, the late great Nigerian novelist, said, the story is our escort. Without it, we are blind. African oral tradition is so important because in the West, knowledge is held by the individual, whereas in Africa it's held communally. And so you'll see how stories are handed down, throughout the centuries. And this is, oral documentary evidence. And there's also, songs and praise songs and poetry and dance. And of course, archaeology tells you a great deal as well. So you've got to use all these sources, and then you build up a more holistic picture of African history, which the Western historians didn't do. They just said, Africa didn't write. You all know that very famous quote by Hugh Trevor Roper, the British historian, who wrote in his book, The Rise of Christian Europe in 1963. He said, there's only darkness in Africa, and darkness is not a subject for history. There's only history in Africa with the arrival of the Europeans. Otherwise, you've just got the gyrations of backward tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. That's more or less what he said. And that kind of view, nobody would perhaps express it so crassly now, but that's the kind of view which has sort of persisted. So I wanted to dispel that with facts. So if you allow me, I'll just explain one, for example. So, there was the Kingdom of Kush, which, in a way, does tell you that at a time, when most of the world was just sort of languishing, living in a very primitive way, these amazing temples and, all other, manner of, palaces and libraries and public baths with running water were existing in Sudan, in northern Sudan. But I think the story of Mansa Musa I of Mali also, I think, refutes, or disproves that idea that there are those who make history and those who stand on the sidelines of history, with the Africans generally being relegated to the sidelines. But if you think of the Mansa Musa, so he was born in 1284 and he died in 1332. but he's best known for a pilgrimage that he made in 1324 to 1325. So the Mali Empire covered huge swathes of West Africa, you know, the Sahel region, Senegal, Gambia, all these places, you know, parts of Mauritania, even bits of Nigeria. Very, very wealthy empire. It was actually established in 1235 by a man called Sundiata Keita, who was the great uncle of Mansa Musa I. Mansa is the name of the kings of Mali. And so Mansa Musa embarked on this pilgrimage to Mecca because by now the kings of Mali were Muslim, and he left with 12,000 members of his own household. He was attended by 500 personal servants. He had 60,000 porters and 100 camels bearing between 10 to 15 tons of gold. And when he went to Egypt, when he went to Saudi Arabia, he stopped in Egypt, in Cairo, both there and back, and he spent so much money, gave away so much gold, that the global price of gold plummeted by 25% and didn't recover its value for more than a decade. And such was his significance that he featured on a map of the world by a Catalan cartographer in 1375, several decades after his death. Now, what the story of Mansa Musa tells you is that the actions of this medieval African king actually had an impact on the international, you know, in the international economy, the global economy. So, you know, this idea that Africa was kind of detached or isolated from the rest of the world is not borne out by the facts. And in fact, if you say to anybody, you know, who is the richest person to have ever lived, you might think, well, I don't know, Elon Musk now, probably he's worth about 230 billion US dollars. It's actually Mansa Musa I. I tested this with Professor Dulai Konate, a wonderful professor at the University of Bamako, the capital of Mali. And I said, you know, I've read estimates that he would be worth about 430 billion US dollars. He said that would be about right, because he had these amazing gold mines and everything. So, you know, that's just one example, dating back to, you know, the medieval period when England, like many other European countries, was, you know, languishing under the Black Death, you know, the plague, you know, populations being decimated. There was this thriving kingdom with Timbuktu, of course, as a great centre of learning, a repository of great African thinking and literature written in Arabic. Mansa Musa himself was, you know, fluent in Arabic and could write it. So, you know, and it attracted scholars from Southern Europe and from other parts of Africa. So, you know, that's what I meant by you have to dispel these myths, not with fairy tales, but with facts.
Oh, thank you for this. And also your recall is brilliant.
I've written a book.
So much of this is about reframing and like recontextualizing, and I think it fits in quite well with the theme of Black imaginations. And I was wondering, while you worked on and researched the book, but also maybe the series, was there anything that shifted for you in the process? Was there anything that you had maybe once believed was fixed before working on the book, and then, you know, it came under question in a similar vein to the quote that we heard earlier?
I don't know if I had a kind of radical shift in my thinking. I mean, this book isn't about contested history. It's not about particularly the colonial era, although I do look at the themes that, you know, that underscored the fight against colonialism. But I think I probably was, it reinforced my views on certain things that I had already suspected, like colonialism. I mean, all the academics, to a man and a woman that I spoke to, were not supporters of colonialism. So, and you know, these are people with PhDs from Cambridge and Harvard and, you know, what have you. And, you know, they all gave their very considered opinions. So I would say that I was reinforced in certain views that I had.
And because there is so much in here, right? You obviously, this is one book, you cannot cover the entire, you know, the events that took place on the entire continent. So I imagine that there was a lot that hit the cutting room floor. Are there any kingdoms or communities that maybe you really, really wanted to try and get in there, but maybe word count said no?
Yeah. It's true. I mean, there's a great deal of stuff that you have to jettison. I mean, I was sorry at the time that I couldn't get to places like Somalia and Libya because of conflicts there. I probably rushed the 19th century. I mean, I wanted to really do the history that's occluded, that people didn't know about. And I kind of felt that, you know, the kind of colonial battles in the 1900s and the 20th century were better known. So I probably, you know, skimmed on those, but they are very interesting, and of course they've fashioned the Africa we know today. So, but possibly that's the subject of another book, is something that's more you know, up to date. But I think that, I mean, you can't do everything, but I think, as I said, that the reader, if they're stimulated, if their interest is stimulated in a particular subject, then hopefully they can go and find out more about that particular aspect of the history that they liked.
I'd love to, just because we've talked a good bit about, you know, Sudan in passing, given the ongoing genocide, displacement, ethnic cleansing, I was wondering for you, how has it been to sit with Sudan's ancient history and very present and currently being made situation today as a Sudanese person?
No, I mean, you know, as I said, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and now I and other members of the diaspora are hoping that we can kind of mobilise a humanitarian effort. It's something I'm turning to quite latterly, and ashamedly, a bit late in the day, but we had all hoped that there'd be some kind of, you know, peace, some negotiations where there'd be a ceasefire, but it seems that the warring sides believe that there is a military solution to this conflict, and we're all rather sceptical that there is. Nobody can seem to get the better of the others, and really the country's descended into anarchy. You know, both sides have militias who nominally support them but are not really under their control, and meanwhile it's the innocent civilians who get caught up. So I think by focusing on the humanitarian aspect, how can you get humanitarian corridors, civilian protection zones, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that rather than just sort of sitting on our hands or, you know, wringing them in despair, we can at least try and see where are the pressure points that the international community, you know, can apply on the combatants to try and bring an end to this. I mean, people often say, oh, people don't really know about what's going on in Sudan. Actually, I think that, you know, people in power are not, it's not ignorance that's the problem. I think it's indifference that really is. And I think Dr. Tedros, in an interview with the BBC, Dr. Tedros is the Director General of the World Health Organization, the WHO, and he said, look, I think people are sort of used to Africans suffering, you know, it's kind of par for the course. There seems to be a hierarchy of deaths with Africans, you know, at the very bottom. And so the people are a bit sort of more immune to suffering on the continent. But I think, yes, it's absolutely, you know, it fills me with great sadness. And also, you know, these treasures that I was talking about, the National Museum in Khartoum, which was recently renovated, has been ransacked apparently and looted by, you know, various people taking out artifacts from, and they've gone, you know, across the border. And I'm just hoping that anybody who receives any of these treasures would have, you know, the sense to try and, you know, raise the alarm. But I mean, when people have no regard for human life, they're hardly going to, you know, respect artifacts, are they? They just see them as a source of money, you know.
And I think this is so crucial when we're talking about genocide and conflict, how a part of this is also the destruction of a people's history, the destruction of a community's history, ensuring that, you know, their artifacts, their museums, the symbols that really crystallize that we were here and form many, many centuries, millennia. I guess, like, from your travels, what did you see in ways that I can't say that word, people who work in museums, paleontologists, but all manner of practitioners, how they are trying to secure artifacts, secure the various, the pyramids that are also gonna, like, the impact of climate change and ecological disaster, like, what is being done from your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two aspects. The monuments that you talk about. So I was just about a couple of months ago on another visit to Ghana, and again went to the slave fort. So you've got this 250-kilometre strip of land, across the Atlantic, where there are about 80 castles and forts and lodges that were used during the transatlantic slave trade, all crumbling, because some have actually crumbled already because of the elements, and there's no effort, real concerted effort to preserve them. And it isn't just something that concerns, West Africans or Africans. As I said, it's part of global history. If there was an atrocity committed like this, against other people, you would see huge efforts to preserve these monuments, and yet they are just really, the ravages of, as you say, climate change and so on. It just means that they are being lost, and I think it's absolutely tragic that that's happening. I mean, I think the Ghanaian authorities, for a start, could double the entrance fee. It's really very, very little to go in, and that could at least help preserve some of these forts like Elmina and St George's and so on. And then in terms of the contents of museums, I visited numerous museums on my journeys across Africa, and really most museums are, the exhibits are quite pathetic in a way. They do their best with the little they have, and when I say the little they have, there was a study commissioned by the French government in 2018. Bénédicte Savoy, a French academic, and Selwyn Sarr, a Senegalese academic, and they got together and carried out a very, very extensive study and concluded that more than 90% of African artifacts and art was held outside the continent. And so, I think that is a tragedy. People may say, well, okay, the Mona Lisa was, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa is in the Louvre in Paris, it's not in Italy, but let's face it, the Italians have got so much else going for them, but the Africans, have got nothing in their museums, and some of them are trying to build up their tourist sector and so on. Of course, it's a case-by-case basis. Who would argue for sending stuff back to Sudan now? Of course, nobody would. But I often think that is used as a blanket reason not to, return anything. I think the travel of direction now is that, there is restitution is very firmly on the debate, is being debated. And I think if you look at, for example, the Benin bronzes, because that's become very emblematic of this whole debate. We've got the Queen Edea, the marvellous bust of Queen Edea, which is in the British Museum, and also the wall reliefs and so on. I mean, the Benin bronzes, they were established. They were made before the 1200s, but from the 1200s, the Oba, the king of Benin, and by the way, this is in southern Nigeria, not the country Benin, created the Royal Guild of Bronze Casters, and from there on, only the king or the royal court could actually commission these bronzes. Most of the ones in the British Museum are from the 1600s or the 1700s. But in any case, this isn't art for just art's sake. As I said, Africans recorded their history in different ways, and these, war reliefs often depict, significant battles, or you can see images of Portuguese mercenaries fighting for the Oba. It gives you an idea of what relations were like with the Portuguese at a certain time. In fact, in the Edo language, which is the language of the people of Benin, Eyasema, Isayema, something like that, it means to remember, but it literally means to cast a motif in bronze. So it shows you how, art is history, and not only involving people of their art, it's also their history, or sacred objects, are often just seen as art. So I think that it's again all part of this whole discussion about, saying Africans and their history and their art and so on, deserve respect, and they deserve the agency, whether it's in telling their own story or whether it's in, reclaiming their art.
This is so fundamental, I think, as well, because it's made me think of Nania Santwa's stall that was taken to the British Library, and it meant that no future women who took her role after her could be named after her, because you need the black stool after an elder passes in order to receive and catch your next name. So then you're robbing a people of their figureheads, their leaders, their connection to their kinship circles, sorry. I guess just sticking with artifacts for a second, on your extensive travels, were there any artifacts that you got to see, eyeball to granite or whatever it was, that just really moved you?
I mean, I don't have any pictures there I could have shown you, but I think the black granite statues, which are life-size, of the kings of Kush, whom I mentioned earlier, probably were, the most evocative, because they're just sort of all standing, with their front right foot forward, and they look, very muscular build, and they're beautiful statues. So I would say that probably those.
What were any of the challenges you faced across the writing and research? Why are you looking at me like that?
No, I'm not.
What challenges did you face across the process?
I mean, look, working in Africa is difficult. Infrastructure is often not as good as it should be, and they love pieces of paper, permissions and so on that have to be acquired. So it's not easy researching or filming, indeed, in Africa. And I didn't just go to capital cities, I went right across countries. I visited Africa's 3 biggest countries: Algeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Sudan, in that order. Used to be Sudan was the biggest country until 2011, when the South seceded. And so I used transport, just about every form of transport known to humankind, fancy cars, old bangers, the odd camel, the odd donkey, on foot a lot. It was quite demanding, very, very demanding. Sometimes we'd get arrested, like, filming on the beach in Alexandria. The marine police came and, confiscated my camera and took us all to the headquarters of the police. I speak Arabic fluently, and so I was lucky that I managed to extricate us. Our fixer said we should all stay in the car, and he went in to talk to the admiral or whoever he was, and he was like an hour, and I thought, this is not working, clearly. And of course I was worried about my footage. So I went in and they managed to tell him. I've got some Egyptian relatives, so I managed to, play that card. I played that card. So I got out, yes.
Was that the only time you got arrested? Or?
In Zanzibar as well.
What were you doing there?
Yeah, filming. And again, there was some busybody policeman. And actually, I didn't have the right permit to film in that particular part of Zanzibar. But this is where it was very lucky, because I have appeared on screen internationally on BBC World. Luckily, some busybody civil servant coming by recognised me and insisted to the policeman that he should release me and my crew. So it was all right in the end.
How are you getting to flex around the continent? Okay. So, given its size, its genre, and the kind of history books that I think maybe a lot of us have grown up being familiar with, that you make an assumption that it's going to be indecipherable or just inaccessible, difficult to follow. I found while reading this, there was just such like an ease, like it felt kind of the way that you talk, like it felt like you're being kind of lulled and taken through. And I mean, I also had a question about footnotes, but I wasn't sure if, this is an audience. An interesting question.
So complete nightmare.
Okay, I'm going to ask you later. But was this decision to the way that you wrote the book, was this something intentional, that you wanted it to be easy and quick and straightforward to understand rather than losing a reader early on?
Yes, I mean, I did feel that I should write in very simple sentences, and this is where, having worked in television, where of course you do write very simple sentences because the viewer doesn't have the luxury of, you know, reading the line again, they have to just hear it. So I do have a relatively straightforward style of writing, but I thought because there were so many facts that it was probably better to keep it simple. I did inject more of my experiences and my travels in the book, but the editors at Penguin, Random House, felt that it held up the history a bit, so they removed some of them. I mean, a few remained, and I think on balance they were probably right, because this isn't about me, you know, this is not about my ego writing this, and it's not even the views in a sense of Zeinab Badawi, but it's really, I'm just a kind of conduit, you know, facilitator for the African academics, of whom many I quote in the book. So I feel that really I'm just, you know, acting on their behalf. I mean, every chapter at the beginning, as I said, has a kind of, you know, debate about what's going on today, the transatlantic slave trade. I look at reparations, apologies versus expressions of regret. I look at the Eastern trade, slave trade, you know, that perpetrated by the Arabs and their partners, which is often not looked at very much, and ask why, you know, people don't talk about that so much. So I try and engage the reader by saying, you know, restitution of art objects in the chapter about Benin's history. So you can kind of see where my opinions lie. You know, I think reparations in some shape or form are probably inevitable and desirable. It's not like my views are absent, but it is essentially, I am just a vehicle for the, you know, if I go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's the Congolese historians I spoke to, really interpreting their history, you know, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Kenya, whatever. But remember, it's not a history of countries, because the countries of Africa weren't really formed until 1884 to 85 with the Berlin Conference, when the European powers carved up the continent between themselves. I mean, there were a couple, Egypt, I suppose, Ethiopia and so on, where you could say there were countries, but by and large, so it's more a regional history. It's not of countries.
I mean, you've mentioned that you kind of skimmed, like, you know, the carving up of Africa and Western and also Eastern imperialism, enslavement and, you know, the slaughter of Africans. You kind of trace from, you know, Leopold's Belgium, Congo. You take us, like, briefly, but through the Rwandan genocide, which can again be traced back to the ethnic hierarchies supported and proliferated by the Belgians. You deal with a lot of topics, even though, again, it makes such a small section compared to the ancient histories and the kingdoms, but even so, you do still deal with histories of anti-blackness, anti-Africanness, and the perceived inhumanity of Africans. You bring that all to the fore, especially towards the end of the book. Was there an emotional toll on you with, just kind of grappling with these topics?
I'm a sturdy girl, so it takes a lot to knock me out emotionally, but I mean, I would say certainly in terms of emotion, you know, it is a passion and a mission for me. It's not something I'm doing because I want to sell copies or whatever. It's not that. It really is something that I felt compelled to do, both in the making of the TV series, but also in the writing of the book. You know, it's a real labour of love, because I just feel that, you know, when I embarked on the TV series, I kind of, in a sense, wrote the book I would have liked to have found before I did that, because there are some things which are quite good written about Africa, but there wasn't kind of a one-stop shop. The volumes that I mentioned are very, very difficult to read. You know, they're written in a very kind of turgid, didactic style. So they're not an easy read at all. And so I wanted something that was quite accessible. and relatively speaking, you know, comprehensive in terms of looking at all the continent, is vaguely chronological as well. So I wouldn't say it took an emotional toll. I mean, it was taxing, but it is something I believe in, absolutely, for sure. You know, there's that wonderful Southern African proverb, when the lions have historians, then the hunters will cease to be heroes. And I think that that is, you know, something which really needed underpinning. And I also felt that, you know, writing a history for the non-African reader, I wanted them to know that Africa had this history before the arrival of the Europeans. And I think for the African reader or African diaspora reader, I'd like them to, because it's really just a narration of a story, it's revelatory, there isn't, you know, it's not a polemical book, but I'd like them to see this narration of history as also a history of hope. It's not, you know, one that ends on a pessimistic note, although understandably when you look around what's happening in Africa, as in Sudan, as we were discussing, you know, you would have cause to be pessimistic, but I think that that's what history tells you when you take the long view. It's not always, you know, like that. And I would say if you take the long view with Africa, and in some cases that could be as little as 20, 25 years, I think there's a great deal to be optimistic about. But I think my mission was to try to overturn the prejudices and the stereotypes that have existed about Africa, particularly in the colonial era. And, you know, these kind of thoughts still govern how people see Africa today, which is why I wanted to reach way back into history to try to correct that. So it's like, you know, jumping on the train at the beginning of the journey, not trying to change things just at the end of the journey. So I think that, you know, it was taxing, but it was invigorating at the same time, because, you know, the lovely environmentalist Wangari Maathai, the late Kenyan Nobel Peace Laureate, who was given the Peace Prize in 2011 for her work on the environment as well as, you know, activism for women, said, you know, you cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that values itself, that understands itself. And I think that, you know, those words of Wangari, who I was very privileged to meet on a number of occasions, very much, you know, was my kind of northern star, you know, the whole way. That and the general history of Africa, very much, you know, my compass.
The gorgeous problem with interviewing a broadcast journalist is that she's going to answer 3 or 4 questions in one go. But thank you so much. I mean, before we go to Q&A, I have a couple of quick questions. I don't know if they're necessarily fun, but they're quick. But please do be thinking up any questions you have for Zeinab, because we'll have 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so when you write, when you're up against it, when you feel, you know, maybe your creativity is running dry, who or what do you write for?
Who or what do I write for?
Yeah, what guides you?
Deadlines.
Okay. If, for some unforeseen reason, you couldn't write in the genre in which you're writing in, so history, what genre would you consider trying your hand at?
I suppose fiction. What other genre is there? Facts or fiction? Fiction, I guess. Although I'm writing a children's version of this, so...
Yeah, but poetry, young adult...
Yeah, no, you're right. No, poetry I don't think I could do. I think fiction, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and my last question is, what advice do you have for African writers currently crafting their own projects?
I think have faith and self-belief in what you're doing, and just keep on, you know, persisting. And I mean, it's not easy, is it, to get, as you know, you're writing a book which will be published next year.
Thank you for the plug.
Yes, it's not easy. I mean, yes, you're writing a book. You've written a book which is now just in its final stages about great African queens. So she's doing a great thing too. And actually, that's something we didn't mention is I try to feminize the history where I can. You know, people take that HIS in history a bit too seriously. It's her story too. So where I could, you know, it's peppered with characters who are female. I mean, the queens of Kush, you know, could rule as co-regents with their husbands and their sons. They had a very powerful role to play. They were known as Candaces, and that's where you get the name Candace from, actually. But you know, it's throughout history. You've got the matrilineal, you know, line of succession, like with the Asante or Ashanti people. So women, you know, this idea of African women being downtrodden wretches is just not the case at all. You know, it never was, and it isn't today.
Amazing. Can we have a round of applause? I am not sure if there is a roaming mic at all. But are there any questions in the audience? Yes, one right at the front. So I'm gonna just come give you my mic and so you can ask Zeinab a question.
So a lot of African history is passed down through generations, as you've alluded to earlier orally. How do you see the conservation of history changing as more Africans disperse across the globe for multiple reasons, or maybe in particular with Sudan and the war and more Sudanese people dispersing around the globe?
No, I think this is a serious issue, because I think that you know, oral tradition, as I said, you know, handed down from generation to generation, and usually in vernacular languages. And we have what the experts call, you know, first language attrition, whereby, you know, if you're from a Yoruba background or Igbo or, you know, whatever, you can sometimes find that there is this erosion of your, you know, your mother tongue. As in my case, I mean, actually, you know, Arabic is my mother tongue, but English is really my first language, so I'm a bit of a victim of first language attrition. It's what I spoke till I was about 4 or 5 years of age, but in any case, I do worry that the custodians of these traditions will be eroded as people, you know, migrate and so on. But I mean, there are real efforts, there are real concerted efforts to try to preserve these languages. Certainly at SOAS, you know, we certainly do that. We've got, you know, a very thriving language department where you can study, you know, Hausa and Yoruba and all the rest of it. So, but it is a worry, it is a worry. As we, you know, globalization, where you see, you know, global culture is increasingly defined as what happens in the West. But I think I'm also heartened by the fact that, you know, you do see a very thriving creative industries in Africa, whereby people are reclaiming their stories and their art and so on. So I think that on the whole, it will survive. But the dispersal of people is something that, you know, is a fact of life and a fact of history. But you're right, the Sudanese, you know, all over the place now because of this.
Any other questions? Okay.
I might be able to shout it.
Yeah, I could.
I think it would be better because just be yourself for everyone.
Right, yeah.
Hello, first to say it really was a wonderful talk. I just wondered if you've had any approaches or you've looked at dramatisation of some of the stories behind the characters. I mean, I'd love to see a series on Netflix or something like that. Is that something that's in the offing?
Well, who knows? Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a great deal of material. I mean, and the stuff is out in the public domain, so I guess anybody can really use that. I think Queen Njinga, who was the queen of the Ndongo Kingdom, which is part of it was a vassal state of the Kingdom of Congo. She was born in 1583, and Jada Pinkett Smith in Hollywood made a drama documentary series about her, which I saw. It was sort of dramatisation of her life. So I think, you know, it's interesting. I doubt that would have been made a while ago. So that's one very, very clear example of the Hollywoodization of African history.
There's one in the middle. Thank you so much for it. Just here. Can you keep your hand up? Are there any more questions? Okay, cute. Okay, back as well.
Hello Zeinab, thank you so much. This book feels so important and so necessary, so thank you very much, and it's been such an informative conversation. I think the question I want to ask is informed by partly having been a school governor for the last 7 years, just stood down, and actually former director of the Africa Centre. The word you talked about wanting to amplify, and I suppose the story of Africa and look at it through a different lens. It struck me that the word decolonisation, which is so often used, often I think triggers perhaps an unhelpful reaction in people, where they think that what we want to do is similar to when you declutter your home. You want to throw all these things away. And actually that seems almost to be the opposite of what is really meant, and I think what is happening, you know, what you're trying to do with your book, which is to amplify the stories that have existed and been told through a particular lens. And so I just wondered if you had any particular thoughts on the use of language and around it, and whether decolonisation is in fact a helpful word or something that can get in the way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I just have a very simple approach to this. I mean, I say it's not about contested history. It's not my history versus your history. It's just saying these are perspectives which have been absent from the discussion, and it's advancing, you know, good scholarship, and who can argue against that? I mean, if you're against, you know, a greater diversity of, you know, knowledge, then good luck to you, because I mean that's bad scholarship. So I think that you're right, maybe that the word decolonisation makes you think about, you know, imperial history, and you know, I don't get to that, and there are 18 chapters, and I don't really get to that until chapter 16 or 17. So I think I did want to move away from that kind of, you know, them versus us, because it then becomes a shrill debate, and there are tin ears on both sides, and it gets you nowhere. So this, as I said, is just about supplementing, it's not supplanting. If you want to go and read your books about the British Empire or whatever, that's fine. It's not a polemical book, it's just a kind of, did you know, kind of book.
Okay, so there was one question up there, and then we're going to come over to this side to answer the questions.
First of all, congratulations on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm fascinated with African history, and just want to big up SOAS as a SOAS alum. But this is more of a sharing than a question, because you mentioned about the writing of African history, how it was written by Europeans before, that, you know, that Africa was considered a dark continent that didn't have any history. So I've been reading a lot about African history for a couple of decades now, and my interest now is more Africans' influence on European history. Just looking at the UK as an example, I've increasingly found that we've been written out of the historical narratives in the UK. Just to give an example, I always felt that the tartan fabric in Scotland had a connection with, I thought it was the kente. Hi Ken, is that Ken? Hi Ken. I wasn't too far wrong. Apparently the oldest tartan fabric comes from a region called the Glen Afrique, and there's a story there of a couple of, suspected this was from the 15th, 16th century. There was a couple of African, there could have been former generals, I'm not sure of their background, but they went to the highlands because it reminded them of where they came from in Africa, which was the highlands of Ethiopia. And when you see the fabric, you immediately think of the fabric that the Masai Mara wear, because that's a checked fabric. And just that as an example of how Africans have influenced the history in the UK. There are many other stories that is going to blow people's minds. Music, especially in the arts. So I was wondering if that could be another book.
I mean, you make a very valid point that, but I think there are people like David Olusoga who, write about the contribution that people of African descent have made to British life or to Europe and so on, and I feel that there are those who are doing that better than I would. So I really just wanted to focus on the continent itself, I suppose. So, but I mean, people like David and others like him are doing a great job in doing exactly what you're saying.
Keep your hands up. So there's one at the right at the back.
Hey, again, thank you for all the work that you've been doing and continue to do. My question for you is, I just finished doing my master's, and the process of research has always been like the longest part, but a beautiful part of it. When you were putting together your book, how did you organize everything that you found, and just the continuous things that you find? What is your process of handling and organizing all of that? Because I know that there is a lot of that.
Well, I think there are two approaches to writing, aren't there? There are those who will make sure that everything on that page before they start the next page is absolutely perfectly crafted and has been done, just as they want it. And then there are those, and I come in this second category of, they put everything down, and slam it down and have it, and then go back to that first page to see and start refining. So I think you take your choice, really. I think some people prefer to do it that way, and others more like me, where you put down everything you think you want to put down, and then you start taking things out and putting it into better order. So I suppose that's how I worked, and then I do all my research first. So, yeah, I mean, I would do all my research first. I mean, mine was a bit different from writing a book, because I already benefited from, I went to more than 30 countries over the period of about 7 years, and I'd seen these things, and also there was that kind of, serendipitous bits of research that just happened upon me from talking to people, that things occurred to me which I didn't know about, and which I then went and found out more about. Or the people I'd interviewed, would give me a book that they'd written. That was also very useful.
Are there any other questions?
Hello, yeah. Hello. Right in Tottenham here, we have a Saturday supplementary school, and I'm really thrilled to hear that you are going to do something for children, because one of the problems we face when we work in or around children